Language will continue to be, I think, the dominant force in our world that unifies or divides us. And we have to, my belief is we have an obligation to strive towards efforts that will use language to bring us together, not to crush individuals' languages and force them to speak the dominant language, but to help them, help all of us be proficient in more than one language.
Hi, I'm Nora Jones. Welcome to It's About Language. This podcast connects language and culture to life, learning, and hope. You'll experience insightful conversations with creative leaders in the fields of education, business, arts, and science. My guests shed light on the impact of language and culture on individuals and society as they share their stories and experiences. You'll be informed and inspired as we explore how language and culture make us human and bring hope in the midst of a challenging world. Well, it's a great pleasure today to welcome to the podcast my friend, David Bong. Hi, David.
Hey, Nora, how are you?
I'm doing well, and I'm very excited to talk with you because you always have such strong insights into language learning, language proficiency, why language even exists. And there's some things that really struck me about your background, David, and I'd like to start with you and some of these aspects and why you express these aspects in your background into the language world, okay?
Sure.
All right. First of all, that I recognize that there's a lot of things that you do that have to do with opening opportunities to people, giving access. Why the access, David? Why so much emphasis on enabling, accessing?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure quite how to answer that, but I think life is all about creating opportunities for yourself and for others. It's why we live, is to make this world a better place. And if people don't have opportunities to grow, to become more than they think they can, then you're not fulfilling the blessing that we have to be alive as a human being at this time and in this place. So I think there's always been a sense that it's important to do those kinds of things, to create opportunity. I mean, that was the way I was raised. As a kid in church, we were always brought around to different faith groups, and taught that people all basically believed the same things. They expressed them in different ways. They had certainly different beliefs, but we all believed many of the same truths, that that we are here on earth. It's a blessing, and we have to make the best of what we're doing to make life better for others, to preserve the world that we have. And so, I don't know, just going on here, but I think that's what it's all about, is creating opportunities.
You went and created so many of these opportunities in the direction of language and language excellence. Why going in that direction, David?
Well, that's kind of weird. I mean, growing up, I grew up in Boston, or just outside of Boston, and I was very provincial in the sense that I had never been out of New England until I was 18. I don't think I ever had been to Connecticut, which is only like 50 miles away.
A very exotic Connecticut, right?
Very exotic, yeah. And I remember taking French and Latin in high school, and I was not a terribly good language student. I just couldn't connect with it, didn't understand what it was for. But I was lucky. I was in a good high school, and they did prepare us well for French. But way back then, I won't say how long ago, we were taking proficiency oriented French, and so now if I'm in France, I can still get around, even after many years. But I first, it's a weird thing, but my first exposure to anything international when I was at wrestling camp. Wrestling was a big part of my life, and there was a an Olympic champion from Japan, um, Mr. Ichiguchi, and I was just struck by his presence. He was powerful, but calm and quiet and gentle. And from that moment on, I always had sort of a fascination with Japan. Then I went to college and ended up being a Japanese history major.
Interesting.
And that started to open up my eyes to Japan. I decided if I'm going to do something related to Japan, I better get over there and really learn the language. So that was my introduction to language. Once I was in Japan, I was hooked, and I could never disconnect from it. And that began to open my eyes to the much bigger world out there.
Well, and you said you used the phrase that you didn't know what language was for in high school. How did your experience in Japan change that?
Well, I mean, I think virtually all of us who are monolingual growing up and have the experience of learning a second language are just amazed when the first experience happens that you can actually communicate with somebody in another language. And I remember sitting on a train going into Tokyo from where I was staying out in the suburbs. And I actually had a conversation where I understood a few words of the guy sitting next to me, and he understood a few words that I said. And it was breathtaking. All of a sudden, there was an entire world open to me. When I was in Japan, I mean, you have to speak the language to eat, right? I mean, you just can't avoid the language. And then it came alive, and I just was just so endlessly fascinated by everything Japanese.
How long did you spend in Japan, David?
Oh, altogether it was a little over 10 years.
And what did you do there? How did you use the language then, once you were embedded?
Well, the first time I was over there, I was a language student, so I went to immersion school for a couple of years, and I'd teach English on the side like everybody did. Then I went back and worked as a translator and worked as a businessman in a health food business, which was kind of interesting. And then finally, my third stint, I was there for 5 years as I set up and ran as far as I know, the only private investigative firm in Japan. It was a branch of a US-based firm from New York. So we were engaged in all kinds of investigations into frauds, extortions, background investigations for acquisitions by US companies, problems Japanese companies had overseas. And that was really fascinating.
You know, you came to a conclusion there, did you not, about how folks got fooled by not understanding language and culture. Explain what you experienced and what the impact was then in your understanding of what happens when people do not understand language and culture as they might.
Well, there's often a gap between management of international companies and their workforces. So in Japan, there are a large number of international firms from the West primarily who would send over managers from Europe or the US or wherever. And they generally were expert in the company and culture of the company, but they didn't speak Japanese or have much background in Japanese culture. And generally, or we would frequently see, not generally, but we would often see that these managers would surround themselves with people who spoke really good English. And these were usually, in our experience, not the most capable people necessarily in the company. Some of the most capable people didn't speak English that well, or they were shy or whatever, but they did not rise to the level where they would be advising the CEO. And so this gap was created, and the CEO didn't understand what was going on in the company. The bulk of the company was not comfortable with decisions being made by management, and there would, in many cases, be some kind of a problem that emerged. We saw a number of really big cases where the employees basically rebelled and threatened to to expose company secrets,
Wow.
and extorted the company. So our job was to go in and find out who were the bad guys. But in fact, bad is sort of an interesting term, because the problem was being caused largely by poor management. It was also interesting that management generally had it wrong as to who the bad guys were.
Interesting. And behind this all was some cultural and linguistic, say, artificial gaps imposed by not recognizing what was lacking.
Mm-hmm.
Well, David, the aspect of language and culture and using language then to accomplish our personal goals and so forth, you were engaged specifically in working with language proficiency, improving language learning, taking a look at standards and so forth. This is an in-depth plumb that you've gotten into when you started out by not really knowing what language was for in high school. How have you turned that? Why you're turning your attention to these external, for example, standards and demonstrations?
Well, through my experience in Japan, I became very focused on the importance of language in terms of identity. And so the importance of effective language learning became apparent. And when my wife Sheila and I moved back to the States after being in Japan on that 5-year stint I mentioned, we decided we wanted to do something to improve language learning in the US, because we saw the impact, as I had described, of not being proficient in a language. So if you look at any endeavor, people are tested all the time. And if they know what the goals are that they're going to be tested on, then they're more effective at reaching those goals. Language testing is I don't know what word to use here, but it's an artifice, right?
Mm-hmm.
You sample what people can do. You can never have a perfect test, because the perfect test is going out in the streets and living every day.
Yeah.
Are you effective at doing that or not? So the perfect test would be to capture 24 hours in somebody's life and see how they engage with people in different situations that were important to them. But the best thing next to that, in terms of helping people understand goals, helping educators be more effective at getting learners to reach those goals, is to build and deliver an assessment that that measures those goals effectively and is scalable and allows assessment to be done in an effective way.
David, making sure that people can speak language well, we have a sort of traditional ways, we've talked about it already a little bit here, of the purpose of language to be able to go and to open new doors and have new experiences and so forth and so on. But take a look more deeply in the experience that you have in reflecting on language and language use in your life. I'm going to ask that question again that you asked in high school. What's language for?
Yeah, so language is just endlessly fascinating. The more engaged I've been with it, the more I've realized the importance of it. And the definition of language is really squishy, and I'm not even going to attempt to address that point. But language is who we are. It's how we express ourselves. It's how it reflects the image that we have of ourselves. So when I was growing up, I worked very hard at developing a real intense Boston accent, because I really wanted to identify as a kid from Boston. And so that's an accent, but it's also language, and it's who I wanted to be and who I was. They say, what's the difference between a dialect and a language? Well, a language is a dialect with an army.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the world as it's probably always existed, that the more powerful elements in the world, their way of expressing themselves, their image of themselves becomes the dominant element. We in the United States have a rather unusual situation in that, except for people who are immigrants or children of immigrants, generally by the third generation, the language that people bring to the US disappears. And so we're still a sadly largely monolingual population. I mean, Greg Roberts has said that monolingualism is the illiteracy of the 21st century, and I agree strongly with him. But it's different from the rest of the world, where people grow up speaking one language and they have to speak another language just to get around. So language in the U.S. is sometimes used as a way of dividing us. The English First movement wants to define the American language as English. There's pushback, people like Greg or Dick Brecht, who's been very instrumental in creating the American languages movement, where all of the languages spoken in our country are valuable. So language is your identity, right? It's a lot of who you are.
Yeah. Okay.
And that can be a point of pride and identity, or it can be something that creates division, and people who don't speak your language are other and give rise to chauvinism and unhealthy attitudes, I would say.
And how then, as a person who values language and has worked with language, how do you discuss language? What do you show about language to those who might consider the language other to be divisive?
Well, that's a really good question, and I don't know if I have an answer for that. Other than doing what we can to explain or describe the journeys that people have had who have learned a second language, and it's opened their hearts and minds and made them more creative, more effective as human beings. I think certainly strengthening language programs in schools is something that can really help. The Global SEAL and the State SEAL movement are really important because they celebrate language skills instead of taking the traditional, I would say, somewhat traditional stance of many places in the US, where heritage languages, people who bring languages to school, are looked down upon because their English may be accented or not perfect. Instead, we celebrate those. And so I'm not so sure there's much we can do in the short run to change people's minds who are dead set against anything having to do with promoting second language learning, or to celebrating people who bring a second language to the society that we live in. But we can celebrate those skills ourselves and make the people who have those skills feel proud of them and not have to hide them. As a society, I think we're foolish to not celebrate those skills because they benefit us psychologically, economically. There's no question that as a society, languages help us in terms of building a more powerful country economically and socially. So
talk about some of those. What are some of the ways, because not everybody does understand the economic impact of monolingualism, or of the putting aside languages, heritage languages that have not been learned in school, which is a traditional way that the United States tends to think about how languages are learned in school, not brought from somewhere else. What are some of the economic and social impact there?
Well, certainly economically, if if a company is eager to do business internationally, having employees who speak another language tremendously supports those goals. You know, Willy Brandt, the mayor of Berlin, once said, "Well, if I want to sell something to you, I'm going to speak in English, but you want to sell me something, then you better speak German."
Uh-huh.
And I think that's true. So if we really want to grow, we need to speak the languages of the world. And English is just not enough. There's also the importance of understanding the culture of another company or country, rather, and language group. So this is one of the insights that Sheila had when she worked for a large trading company in Japan. Sheila, my wife, partner. So she would be sitting on the Japanese side negotiating with Americans over some deal. She was working in biotech joint ventures, and they'd have a discussion. And afterwards, the Americans would come up to her and say, "Oh, what's next?" They said, your boss said, "We'll think about it." And so they said, "Well, what's next?" And she said, No, you don't get it. They said, the answer is no. They didn't understand that by gently saying, "Well, we'll consider it," the Japanese are saying, "No, we're not interested."
Ah.
And that's a very kind of simple example, but there were so many examples in her experience and mine as well, where there was just a disconnect, where people just didn't understand what the other culture, the other language was expressing through its words or through its body language. And that lack of understanding generates huge economic losses. There's all kinds of statistics about how the lack of language skills causes billions of dollars in lost revenue for companies in America, largely in English-speaking countries, because we tend to be the guiltiest of not speaking another language.
David, look again at heritage speakers in the United States. What is the potential role of heritage speakers? How do we communicate with those who are not familiar with what heritage speakers can contribute so that their roles are more clearly understood and supported?
So first of all, I think the Seal It by Literacy movement, both the state and the global seals, have played a substantial role in improving the understanding, both on the part of heritage speakers themselves, but also society at large, of the important skills that the heritage language speakers bring to our society. There are countless job opportunities out there for people who speak another language. You know, Spanish is clearly the language that's the most in demand, but there are other languages as well. Banks need tellers who speak Spanish. Stores need clerks. There's just a huge demand for people who have a second language. Now, many heritage speakers have, there's all kinds of terminology for it, but let's say less formal language.
Okay.
So it's the language of the home, the kitchen, whatever, but it's not literacy. And that's why the seals of biliteracy are so important, because to become literate is important if you're going to get a job in that language. And so expanding programs that teach literacy, having a reward. Again, it's that goal. The goal of literacy becomes more important when you have something that celebrates it. And then it becomes more economically viable, which isn't to say that those home variations or varieties of language, kitchen, whatever you want to call it, aren't valuable or important. Those are the languages that are spoken at home. Those are real languages. They're valuable. They allow communication. But they're not necessarily what you need in order to get a job or become a part of the economy using the language. So I think there's just a whole set of elements that make those skills, those language skills, more economically important, more socially recognized, and more psychologically beneficial to the people who bring those languages. The seal, the incentive, and the measurement, the recognition of those skills in schools, the teaching of those skills, both by schools. There's a huge movement in the heritage language community or community-supported heritage language schools.
Okay.
There are many languages that are taught on Saturdays, typically Saturday schools. Those are really important for the infrastructure in our country.
Speak more about that.
We have a lot of interaction at Avant, my company, with languages that are brought to the United States. Many languages from the country of India or Pakistan, Asia, all over the world. There are community schools that teach those languages, and they're increasingly being brought into the mainstream of language education in the US. And we think this is a very healthy movement because it promotes the learning of those more formal elements of the language that make the language more economically valuable, and also add to the pride of the community and I think the individual pride that students have as they grow in the language that they speak at home and the skills that they bring. So Joy Payton has led a group, the Community-Based Heritage Language School Conference, and there's increasing understanding that those schools have to work with existing standards, the proficiency guidelines that are used in educational systems across the United States, so that they begin to teach in alignment with the other programs, and they'll improve the if you will, the academic or the literary skills of these students.
That's fascinating. And one of the things that keeps bubbling up here is the pride of the individual and so forth. The nature of language as affirming the individual. What kinds of progress have you seen in that with regard to the kinds of activities and your company or organizations that you're engaged with, helping individuals to reflect on their own pride?
That's a good question. I mean, certainly the work that these community schools are doing, the work in education systems across the country, the state of Washington, Texas, New Jersey, have been leaders in competency-based credits. So students who can demonstrate proficiency in all four skills, reading, writing, speaking, listening, usually through testing, can receive high school credits. There was a study that the Gates Foundation funded in the greater Seattle area a few years back, and we were providing much of the testing for that, where they funded testing for heritage students to qualify them for high school credits. And they found that about 32% of the students who were Spanish-speaking heritage kids needed those credits to graduate from high school. So the credits that they earned through that program allowed them to graduate from high school.
Interesting.
And we see this across the country, that just recognizing skills that students bring to the classroom enables them to graduate from high school. Another, I think it was 13% of those students needed those credits in order to qualify for higher education, because most, certainly 4-year institutions require at least 2 years of language study. That was huge.
Mm-hmm. No question. Wow. Okay, so David, we've been talking about basically solving problems, moving in positive directions, making a difference, and it's slow going, but on the way. But you've said to me at one point that some things will just stay confused. That's language. What do you think will just plain old stay confused?
My goodness. Well, what is a language, right? Is it a dialect? Is it a Creole? Is it an accent? What's the definition? That's always going to stay confused. Uh, are we moving towards a single language? Well, probably not. And actually, I hope not. But there's English, which has become the sort of lingua franca of the world, if you will, using mixed linguistic
I was going to say
elements there. And I don't know what's going to happen. I think the world is evolving just very, very quickly. Languages are changing very quickly. I looked up some numbers before this. 50% of the world speaks 20 languages.
50% of the world speaks 20 languages.
Right.
Wow.
4% of the world speaks 96% of the total languages out there, the 7,000 or so that exist. We have a language dying every 14 days. So is it important to maintain those languages? We believe so. We think it's critical. Why? Because, as I've said in a couple of different ways through this conversation, that language is identity. But language can also be a tremendous barrier to peace and harmony in our world. So how do we get to the point where people can have their identity and their pride that comes from their language, and yet be able to communicate and integrate with the rest of the world? I have a good friend who spent many years in West Africa translating Bibles. And his perspective was that the language that the colonizers brought and enforced on the population, in this case French, was a unifying factor in many of these countries where the individual languages were a divisive element. But French, because there was no tribal connection to it, minimized or reduced some of the friction and the tension and the warfare between groups. So it can be a unifying factor. Esperanto was started back in the late 1800s as a language that the creator of it thought would be helpful so that people could maintain their own cultural attachment to their language, but have a common language that everybody could speak. And of course, this has gone on throughout history. You've got Swahili in East Africa as the language of commerce. You've got Chinook out here on the northwest coast that was the Native American trading language, where people needed something to transcend their own language that had boundaries and limitations. Mm-hmm. But they wanted to maintain that identity that came with the language they held in their own culture. In Japan, we saw a very sad case of a student who his parents had meant well for this young Japanese boy, but they had kind of shuttled him back and forth between Japan and the United States, going to private school in the States, then back to Japan to school. And he was basically non-lingual in the sense that he didn't have a dominant language. And so he was kind of lost. He wasn't fluent in either language, and he was just kind of bereft.
Wow.
And this is rare, but you do see it. It's also very rare to see truly bilingual people. We have a couple of friends in Japan who speak perfect accentless English with, having received master's degrees in Ivy League schools, and also speak perfect Japanese. They operate in Japan as high-level professionals. But those people are pretty rare. But in any event, language will continue to be, I think, the dominant force in our world that unifies or divides us. And we have to, my belief is we have an obligation to strive towards efforts that will use language to bring us together, not to crush individuals' languages and force them to speak the dominant language, but to help all of us be proficient in more than one language.
Beautifully said, David. I would like you now to turn, if you will, your attention to the folks that are listening to this podcast and give them one last invitation, exhortation, warning, whatever you'd like to interpret. What would you say to our listeners specifically now?
Recognize the value of language, the beauty that it brings to our lives, and see it as a unifying, not as a dividing element. There's one event that I think is going to be really important for people to participate if they would like to participate in, and that's the Global Coelobate Literacies event coming up in December called Global CRED, Credentialing and Recognizing Excellence and Determination, which is, in my mind, what it takes to become proficient in a second language. It's an event that's going to bring language learners together from around the world, educators, and it's going to give insights into how to become more proficient in a second language, what it means, share experiences. So I hope you'll all be able to participate in that. It's a free event.
That's phenomenal, and I'm sure, as powerful as it's likely to be, David, that it will be an annual, at least, event. I certainly hope so.
As do we.
That's fantastic. David, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. Always very thoughtful, very touching, and very much oriented to transforming the world. As always, thank you, David.
Thank you, Nora, for all you do.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends, family, and colleagues. Let's continue the conversation. Be sure to check out my website, fluencyonline.com, to learn more about our guests and to check out the resources and information they've shared with us there. I have other ideas, resources, and opportunities there for you too. Again, thanks so much for listening, and until next time.